Hello, welcome to the Intersect, where academia, industry, and the DoD meet. I'm Matthew Butkovic. Today I'm joined by my colleague, John Haller. Hello, John. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome, Matt.
Today we're going to discuss protecting the defense industrial base and specific techniques, methods, and models to do that. Chief among those being the CMMC, which I'm sure our audience has heard a great deal about. But let's start at the very beginning, John. Can you explain what CMMC is?
So CMMC is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It dates back to sort of begin at the beginning, right? Back in 2010, the federal government released Executive Order 13556, which basically started an examination of controlled, unclassified information. In other words, information that is created, entrusted by the federal government to private entities or created for and on behalf of the federal government. And they basically said that the government agencies and really all of those private entities needed to do a better job of protecting the government's sensitive information, or again, CUI, controlled unclassified information. Now, we'll probably get into this. There's a specific DoD component of that. The original EO applies to information from a variety of different government agencies. CMMC is really focused on the defense industrial base and information that's of critical importance to national defense and defense systems.
So I'm hearing, John, is this is a method to assess the trustworthiness of those that are given access to a specific type of information.
That's right. So this was originally codified, or initially codified, in a NIST standard, NIST 800-171, right? So around the 2014 or so era. And what the DoD did at that time was they looked at controlled unclassified information that pertained to the defense industrial base and defense systems. And they, in the DFARS clause, the acquisition regulation for DoD, they basically said, as part of that defense business, contractors in the DIB had to comply with NIST 800-171. There was originally a deadline of, I think, the end of 2017 to comply with 171. And to make kind of a long story short, they found after some auditing in 2018 that some of the defense contractors that they looked at were not, in fact, complying with 800-171. And there was a whole lot that went into that. But they, and unfortunately what the DoD experienced is certain defense systems where information was obviously leaked or stolen in some cases by adversaries. And this started a chain of events to start to validate compliance to 800-171, and that defense contractors are actually protecting the information.
So moving from a self-testing, self-attestation method of working to one where there's additional examination of those that are trusted with CUI.
That's right.
Right. And I imagine that if this sort of information is lost, right, there's significant damage to these defense systems programs, or this very sensitive information that we're talking about.
Sorry.
Now, John, as you know, the SEI has a history in developing models and solving these sorts of problems. And that was the case when CMMC was first contemplated. We, the SCI, along with our partners at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, were asked to construct a model drawing on the things that we knew worked and that provided valid and rigorous measurement. So, John, maybe for our audience, could you describe at a high level what the CMMC model looks like and how it's applied?
Right. So as you mentioned, the SEI was involved in helping to create the model, right? We're in a good position to do that because there's a long history here of looking at models and frameworks to enable reliable software that meets requirements. And then later, we, of course, developed the CERT resilience management model, looking at similar methods and tools to support security and resilience in an organization. The model went through a couple different iterations. Early versions of the model applied a lot of those maturity concepts, right? And there were essentially different levels of maturity, 5 different levels based on the inherent risk of whatever the information related to. There was, obviously a federal comment period, and as most of the listeners will appreciate, there's been a lot of discussion about sort of the costs of compliance versus the risk, and the cost for the cost for defense contractors, right, relative to the risk. I think it's important to keep in mind that we spend a lot on defense, and we should. If foreign adversaries get that information, you could say that's kind of wasted money, right? In other words, the taxpayer has a very legitimate interest in making sure that our defense capabilities are actually protected, and that the information is protected. So in any event, we went through the comment period, or the federal government went through the comment period. At a certain point, it was decided that the model should stick a little bit more closely to the actual requirements, or the specific requirements of NIST 800-171. A lot of the those governance and management activities are actually in the model. I think people kind of don't think about this enough, right? The model still requires all of the governance, all of the oversight, right, that are required for maturity, right? It sticks a little bit more closely to the actual requirements of 800-171, which have been in place since 2016.
Sure, John. So let's explore that for just a minute. So the model was revised and in some ways kind of optimized to meet the DIB where it is, right? So
That's
the DIB is this diverse set of organizations. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
Yeah.
Something that I think we should mention is that if you are currently contemplating CMMC conformance testing, or understanding your ability to meet the requirements of CMMC, that doesn't preclude you from considering other measures, such as the measures of institutionalization of practice and process we have in the cert resilience management model. So we could do an Intersect just on that. But one of the things I want the audience to understand is you can think of CMMC as not the ceiling, but the floor. You can actually add, as needed or as desired, to your assessment mechanisms and your compliance regime, right, to consider other dimensions or measures of capability. Is that correct?
That's right. And also, I think there's a real business driver for doing that, right? In other words, especially if I think it applies to small and medium-sized businesses as well as larger organizations. But let's say you're an organization where you may have, and this is pretty common, you may have a variety of different compliance obligations, right? You may have compliance-related obligations relating to financial services, or you may have compliance obligations relating to HIPAA. It's not unusual that organizations have to comply with a lot, right? Something like the cert resilience management model, or a model to look at your processes around compliance, or, for example, your processes around asset management and asset inventory, can help you to satisfy a variety of different compliance obligations. Why is that? It's not because, you're sort of just adding practice or adding assessment kind of for the fun of it. The idea is that having a degree of maturity around compliance, around controls management, right? Like looking at the controls that would be common across a number of your compliance obligations, is a real benefit to kind of doing this a little bit more efficiently, right? In other words, if you have 3 or 4 different compliance obligations, you shouldn't be thinking of them in silos, right? You should, in other words, I have to comply with XYZ with a set of controls, and I have to comply with obligation 2 with a set of controls. If you apply a little bit of maturity and some of the things that we kind of think about in the cert resilience management model, it can help you to manage some of those controls a little bit more efficiently. But it certainly depends on, in my mind, it depends on the organization and kind of some of the inherent risk, right? If you're a small organization and you're just getting started, and you have, one and only one compliance obligation, the CMMC, then you kind of need to get started with specific practices in the CMMC.
Yeah. So John, let's talk about that. The DIB, as I mentioned, it comprises organizations of all sizes and capabilities, from machine shops that make a specialized part for a defense system, through very large organizations that create weapon systems, large platforms, and everything in between. So, John, thoughts about the size and shape of the DIB? How many organizations do we generally consider to be count as DIB organizations in the United States?
Right. So it's important to realize that we don't exactly have a really clear inventory of every organization that's in the defense supply chain.
Because often these organizations are selling to the Department of Defense and lots of other people, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And also because, frankly, if you kind of think about like contracts and contract law, up until fairly recently, there's sort of privity of contract, right? Like I have relationships with my subcontractors to provide you, Matt, with a service, right? Traditionally, you may not necessarily have visibility to all of my subcontractors unless you ask for it, or unless there's a compliance obligation that tends to force it. So to answer your question a little bit more specifically, the estimate for the DIB in total is around 220,000 firms, which is
it's a significant number.
It's a pretty significant number of companies, right? Now, it's probably good for the listeners to realize that the CMMC does not apply in the same way to all of those 220,000.
Yeah, let's talk about that, John. So it is differentiated, and I understand there's levels in the model. Can you maybe speak to just the basic outline of what those levels look like, and then we'll tie it to the shape of the DIB?
Yeah, that's right. So there's 3 levels to the model. The most basic level, and frankly, this is based on inherent risk. When we constructed this and when the DoD asked for this, I think everyone realized that some tiering or some differentiation based on risk kind of made sense. So the first tier is really the FAR tier. This is basic Federal Acquisition Regulation. This is basic federal contracting information, where essentially 15 information security requirements apply. I would call this sort of hygiene or the basic information security blocking and tackling.
So, John, that's important. So, level 1 in the model then is akin to cyber hygiene. So, it's the bare minimum set of activities and controls that you'd expect.
Make sure you're managing vulnerabilities. Make sure you have an awareness of your assets. Make sure that you're managing access. Yes, it's essentially cyber hygiene.
And what percentage or what slice of the DIB of those 200,000 plus companies do we expect will need to conform at level 1 and only at level 1?
Yeah, that's a pretty large number. That's getting close to the 220,000, right?
Okay.
Or around 200,000. Now, the nice thing about that, or I would say manageable thing about that, is they are relatively simple requirements, right? If you think about level 2, which we'll talk about, level 2 is 110 requirements. It goes into a lot more depth, right? Level 1 and for FAR information really is pretty simple.
Okay, so thank you. You've explained then the expectation at level 1. At level 2, you mentioned there's more controls or practices,
right?
And you said 110, I believe.
That's right.
And then what number of DIB organizations of the total do we expect will be at level 2?
Yeah, so level 2, the estimate hovers around 80,000.
80,000, okay.
That's right. In level 2, you're getting to CUI, actual controlled unclassified information that relates directly to defense capabilities. And the number is around 80,000 firms. And then requirement-wise, it's up to about 110 requirements. Again, which I would classify as information security, definitely at a higher level of sophistication, right? And at a higher level of risk relative to the risk of CUI compromise. But information security practice, about 110 practice.
In my understanding, these things are already required.
That's right.
Prior to CMMC by virtue of being the controls found in NIST 171, correct?
Right. The actual requirement, what contractors have to adhere to has not changed, right? The CMMC is really an effort to essentially make sure and audit at some level.
And before we move on to level 3, and one of the things that would be of great interest to the audience is the change in the way of working from a self-testing, self-attestation method to, in CMMC, a portion of DIB organizations are now subject to a third-party assessment.
That's right.
So can you just unpack that a little bit for us, John, at level 2?
Right. So at level 2, for any CUI that's related to defense capabilities, right, it is essentially assessment, including looking at evidence, right, by private third-party assessment organizations or certified third-party assessment organizations or C3PAOs. 99% of DIB contractors, sort of round numbers, right, who are at level 2 will need a C3PAO assessment. Now, there is an allowance at level 2 for self-attestation, or I should say self-assessment, right? But that's very narrow, and it's really if think about a scenario where that DIB contractor or DIB member has controlled unclassified information that doesn't relate directly to defense capabilities, right? So one scenario might be a DIB contractor who, based on the business they're involved in, let's say they have strictly PHI or health information, right? There's some allowance if you're in another CFI category for self-assessment, but it's quite narrow. And of course, in the case of PHI, you'd still be subject to HIPAA
Sure.
and various other obligations. But did that answer your question?
Absolutely, John. So as we're going up the stack here, so describe level 3 to me.
Yes. Yeah. So level 3 is really, what I would call kind of the higher level of inherent risk.
And it's the top level of the scale, correct?
And it's the top level of the scale. So what comprises level 3? So these are things where it's new advanced technology, right? Things that are truly groundbreaking, groundbreaking application of technology to defense capabilities. Like a lot of things when you're talking about risk, it's not always exactly defined, right? But a very large aggregation of CUI. And the other thing, which is an important risk concept, is information where if it would be compromised would create a substantial vulnerability across all of DoD or across all of the U.S. defense capability, right? You can kind of I think of this a little bit like a single point of failure, right? If this is something that's compromised, you'll see this type of impact across the services, and across our defense capabilities. So that's level 3. So it's essentially the highest level of in the risk world, what we would call inherent risk.
So it's important to maybe reinforce that the expectations are scaled or proportional to the risk.
Right.
And of that large population of organizations that comprise the DIB, what percentage of organizations do we believe will need to be assessed at level 3?
Yeah, the estimates kind of hover around 300 to 1,000. 300 to 1,000.
Okay, right. So it's a relatively small number.
Relatively small. It's also important to kind of let the listeners know, or anyone involved, interested in CMMC, it's an additional 24 requirements that are actually drawn from 800-172, rather than 171.
And my understanding is that those are designed to blunt advanced types of attacks and novel attacks. So it really is designed to keep pace with the adversary.
Yeah, I don't think, by the way, from that, nobody should assume that the advanced persistent threat, where those adversaries are not interested in information at level 2, they certainly are. That's really good.
Right. That's a good point to make, John. Right? That it's not as if their interest or their ambitions are only at level 3.
That's right. Right.
Okay.
But nevertheless, level 3 is where those types of threats would be particularly interested, and where there's just a higher expectation based on risk.
Thanks, John. So one of the things I'm a big believer in is learning from comparison. So something you and I share is we both worked in banking, in addition to working here at the Software Engineering Institute. And in banking, we face regulation, always have. And you and I were discussing this a little bit before the show, that our experience needing to conform with regulation in banking, in part, informs the way we look at this. And one of the things I'm interested in is your thoughts on what we can learn from that experience. Now, maybe to show my hand a little, very small banks and the largest banks all need to conform to a relatively comparable set of regulation, right? There's some base concepts. And it seems to me that there is some comparison potential between what we knew in financial services and what we're seeing in the DIB. It's just that DIB is experiencing this application of requirements a little later in a slightly different form than we knew in banking. Thoughts about that, Johnny? That was a lot of a ramble from me, but just thoughts about that idea.
Well, I think it was a good ramble. So there are many critical infrastructure sectors, right, that are subject to regulation and cybersecurity and basically resilience regulation or resilience-oriented regulation. I think you hit the nail on the head that in some ways, the DIB is a little bit late to the party, right? There's a lot. There are ways that banking regulation is a little bit different, but there are ways that I think are instructive that it's very similar, right? So if you think about Gramm-Leach-Bliley, right, the basic information security regulation and requirement that applies to banking, it's structured a little bit differently, right? I'm thinking of like 12 CFR Part 30, right, which is where the government or the CFR really lays out the basics, and it says you have to have an information security program. It says that you have to assess risk. The idea of a risk assessment, I would say, is a little bit more prominent within GLBA, right? And then it says you have to have a program and controls across a range of different areas: access management, encryption, change management, incident response, that are appropriate to the risk, right? The thing that's important to understand about that is it applies to all of the financial industry, but it also includes specific standards, right? In other words, when your regulator comes to you and assesses and examines you as a financial institution against GLBA, there's definitely a risk assessment and risk management component to that, but they look to specific standards and requirements, much like in CMMC, to determine if your financial institution is doing the right thing, right? So one of the big drivers of that in the financial industry is the FFIC, the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Committee. So this is basically
rolls off the tongue.
Right, rolls off the tongue. So this is basically regulatory harmonization for the financial industry, where for years the FFIC has provided, not just in cyber but different areas, or in technology but different areas, have provided a common set of standards and specific requirements, right? And frankly, that's the basis for determining if what you do as a financial institution, is really appropriate relative to the risk, right? So at the end of the day, there's no getting out of the need to have specific technology standards and to control that risk if you're part of critical infrastructure, right? And I don't think anybody would argue that the defense industrial base is not part of critical infrastructure. There is, for smaller institutions, there is a little bit of, you get back to that managing the risk part a little bit. The requirements, obviously, the bigger you go up in terms of size of financial institution, the more scrutiny there is. But it still comes back to specific standards to control your risk.
Yeah, it's a really good points, John. That and there may be folks in the audience that have had this experience of working across various sectors, right? And the goal in my mind is to find efficiency,
right,
and ensure that you're not over-indexing in your need to comply. Again, I'm a big believer in process. I think the artifacts we've created here in the CERT division of the Software Engineering Institute really help the CERT Resilience Management Model. And then certainly we're very proud of our work in CMMC, working with our partners in the Department of Defense. So if you're facing for the first time, I guess the takeaway in my mind is there are analogs and examples of how this is done and has been applied in other sectors and even within the DIB to learn from, right?
That's right.
It seems daunting at first. It doesn't need to.
It seems daunting. There are, in terms of process and sort of the resilience of what you do to manage these risks and what you do to manage compliance, there are a few processes that really cross over into different areas, and that might be, like you mentioned, CERT RMM, right? Having defined processes to do these activities and then actually applying some maturity of it to it in an organized way. Do you measure how you do it? Do you measure if it's meeting your plan? Do you measure if it's effective? Do you have metrics and measurement? Do you escalate issues to senior management? Probably not all of the basic practices are created equally in your organization. You should probably think about if you're trying to comply with CMMC or CMMC and other obligations, what do you really need to focus on from a maturity perspective? What do you need to be really good at to make sure that you're managing all these things effectively? Like one example that kind of comes to mind is asset management.
Yes.
Right. Understanding, particularly in the case of controlled unclassified information and defense information, understanding where your information is, how you're exchanging information, and whether your activities to exchange information are sort of meeting your plan. I'll give you an example. There have been real cases where defense contractors have shared information to subcontractors didn't know where the information was, shared too much information. Think about like plans for the landing gear on a fighter jet, sharing that information, which is specific and sort of least privilege, right? Versus sharing all the plans because you didn't have the processes in place to split that information out and really understand what needed to be shared. That's the kind of thing that if you don't have a process and you don't sort of measure that and you don't make sure that it continues in your organization, can kind of get you in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like the most fundamental building block, right? So I'm thinking about another experience that I had in industry, which is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act conformance, right? The 404 testing.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that CMMC and SOX similar in that they're designed for one end. In the case of Sarbanes-Oxley, 404, it's to ensure the integrity of the balance sheet, right? Doesn't mean that being conformant means you'll survive a disruptive cyber event, but the balance sheets will be accurate.
Right.
CMMC, it's designed to protect a specific type of information. Again, this is where I think we should view these things as a floor rather than a ceiling. To your point, you can find efficiency, and the rising tide will lift all of your cyber boats, right? If you focus on core activities like asset management. I would argue you can't do incident management well without asset management. Right. To your point, you can't do information protection well without asset management.
Right.
So it seems a bit nuanced, but for the audience, I believe there's great benefit in considering these fundamental or foundational processes and then determining how investments or gains in capability pay dividends across your regulatory obligation in several silos.
That's right. That's right. Ideally, if you have several different compliance obligations, what you will often find is that the language and the specifics and the sentence in the regulation may differ, right? But it comes down to core blocking and tackling of information security, right? I mean, one way to manage all of these different controls is to think about the ones that are common, almost like a Venn diagram, right? Mm-hmm. And the ones where a specific obligation is really asking you to do something distinct and separate. And managing all of that is an area where having a process to do it and thinking about it across kind of, I want to say the life cycle, but across the waterfront of what your business is can be really helpful.
Great, Sean. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. I know that for many viewers, this is a topic that's front of mind for many reasons. I hope today that we've explained the fundamentals of what CMMC is and given them some pointers as to how we best believe you can achieve conformance. If you're interested in this topic, there are other artifacts on the SCI website, and also there's a slate of things that are planned for the future. So I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon, and thanks again, John.
Thank you, Matt.